Why the penny is becoming obsolete. You've probably seen one lying on the ground and not bothered to pick it up. A single penny is just 1 cent, so small it feels almost meaningless. But that wasn't always true. There was a time when a penny mattered enough to buy something, save something, and even shape how people talked about money itself. Now it's caught in a strange middle ground, still legal currency, but increasingly treated like it doesn't belong in the modern economy. So the question, in just what happened to the penny? It's why something that once defined everyday money is slowly fading out of relevance. When a penny actually mattered, it's easy to forget that the United States 1 cent coin, the penny, was never meant to feel insignificant. In fact, for much of its history, it represented real, everyday purchasing power. It wasn't symbolic pocket clutter. It was part of how people actually lived, bought things, and understood value. In earlier eras of the U.S. economy, prices were low enough that a single cent could still matter. A penny might not have bought anything large on its own, but it could contribute meaningfully to a purchase, or directly pay for small goods that were genuinely useful in daily life. Candy, basic household items, simple services, and small treats were often priced in cents, not dollars. Money operated on a much finer scale, and the penny fit naturally into that system. This made cash transactions feel more granular and physical. Unlike today, where digital payments and rounded totals are common, people routinely dealt with exact change. Coins weren't just leftovers from a larger bill, they were necessary pieces of the system. Every cent had a place, and the penny was the foundation of that structure. The design of the coin itself also reflected its importance. The United States 1 cent coin has been in circulation since the late 1700s, long before modern banking systems and electronic payments existed. Back then, the idea of dividing currency into small, tangible units was essential for trade. A penny represented more than just a fraction of a dollar. It represented accessibility. It allowed people to participate in everyday commerce without needing large sums of money. Even psychologically, the penny had weight. Holding a handful of coins meant something different. When each one had practical value, saving coins wasn't just a habit. It was a form of accumulation that could be directly felt. People didn't think of pennies as trivial. They thought of them as building blocks of larger financial decisions. This is also where many cultural ideas about money began to form. In a world where small amounts truly mattered, expressions like careful saving and frugality weren't abstract advice, they were practical survival strategies. The penny became a symbol of discipline and attention to detail, because even the smallest amounts could add up in meaningful ways. Over time, however, the economy evolved. Prices rose, wages increased, and the relative value of a single cent began to shrink. What once could buy something tangible slowly became too small to function as an independent unit of exchange. The penny didn't disappear, but its role began to shift from something useful to something symbolic. Looking back, the interesting part isn't just that the penny existed, but that it once fit so naturally into everyday life. It was part of a financial system where nothing was too small to matter, and that contrast between a world where every cent counted and one where cents barely register at all helps explain why the penny feels so strange today. It hasn't changed. The world around it has. A coin that shaped language and culture. Even as the penny has faded from everyday use, it has left something behind that hasn't disappeared: language. Long after its practical importance declined, the United States 1 cent coin continues to live inside the way people speak, think, and express value. It has become less of a coin and more of a cultural reference point embedded in everyday communication. Phrases like "a penny saved is a penny earned," "a penny for your thoughts," and "put your 2 cents in," all come from a time when small amounts of money had real significance. These weren't decorative expressions. They reflected a financial reality, where even a single cent could matter in daily life. Saving pennies wasn't symbolic, it was practical advice rooted in necessity. What makes these sayings interesting today is the gap between language and reality. Most people using them don't think about literal pennies anymore. Instead, the phrases function as metaphors for thrift, curiosity, or opinion sharing. The original monetary meaning has largely faded, but the structure of the language remains intact. like an imprint of an older economy still visible in modern speech. This is how the penny became something unusual, a piece of currency that outlived its full usefulness but survived through culture. It stopped being just money and became a linguistic artifact. Even as its economic role diminished, its presence in language kept it alive in a different form. The phrase "a penny for your thoughts," for example, reflects a time when curiosity and conversation were gently priced in metaphorical terms. Offering a penny wasn't about literal payment. It was a symbolic invitation for someone to share what they were thinking. Today, the phrase still carries that meaning, even though the coin itself no longer holds meaningful purchasing power. Similarly, "put your 2 cents in" suggests that everyone's opinion has a small but recognized value. The expression assumes that even a modest contribution matters in discussion. Ironically, as the real-world value of 2 cents has declined, the phrase has become even more detached from its literal origin while remaining socially useful. Perhaps the most famous example, "a penny saved is a penny earned," highlights the historical importance of frugality. In earlier economic conditions, saving small amounts of money was not just wise, it was essential. The phrase survives today as advice, but its urgency has softened. It now feels philosophical rather than practical. What's striking is how naturally these expressions persist, even when their original context has disappeared. Language tends to preserve history in ways that economics does not. Coins can be redesigned, devalued, or phased out, but phrases continue to circulate as long as they remain meaningful in a broader sense. In this way, the penny has achieved a kind of cultural afterlife. It may no longer play a central role in transactions, but it continues to shape how people describe value, thought, and communication itself. The coin has shrunk in economic importance, but expanded in symbolic reach, and that is the quiet legacy of the penny. Even when it stops functioning as money, it doesn't stop functioning as meaning. Inflation quietly reduced its power. The decline of the penny didn't happen in a single moment or through a clear decision. There was no sudden announcement that made it less useful. Instead, its value was eroded slowly over decades by something far less visible but far more powerful: inflation. Inflation doesn't destroy money in an obvious way. It doesn't erase coins or remove them from circulation. It simply reduces what each unit of money can buy over time. A dollar becomes slightly weaker, then a little weaker again, and over enough years, those small changes completely reshape how everyday currency functions. The United States 1-cent coin is a clear example of this gradual shift. When the penny was more deeply integrated into daily life, prices were low enough that 1 cent could still play a meaningful role in transactions. But as the cost of goods and services rose over time, the purchasing power of that same cent steadily shrank. It didn't disappear, it just stopped being enough to matter on its own. This change was so gradual that it was easy to miss. Unlike a policy change or a redesign of currency, inflation works silently in the background of the economy. People adapt without noticing. Prices adjust upward, wages shift, and new expectations form around what money is supposed to buy. The penny stayed the same physically, but its economic context kept moving away from it. Eventually, this created a disconnect between the coin and everyday commerce. While it still functioned as legal currency, it no longer functioned as a practical unit of value. Very few items were priced at 1 cent. Even small transactions rarely required exact cent-level precision in the same way they once did. The penny became less a tool of exchange and more a leftover fragment of an older pricing system. This is where inflation reveals its subtle power. It doesn't remove usefulness overnight, it gradually pushes things below the threshold of attention. When a unit of money becomes too small to influence decisions, people stop treating it as meaningful, not because they consciously reject it, but because it no longer changes outcomes in a noticeable way. Over time, this shift alters behavior. Pricing systems adjust. Cash transactions begin to round implicitly or rely more heavily on larger denominations. Even psychological perception changes. Amounts once considered important begin to feel negligible. What used to be carefully counted becomes loosely acknowledged. The penny didn't fail because it was broken. It became obsolete because the world around it changed faster than it did. Inflation redefined what small money means, and the penny slowly slipped beneath that threshold. It still exists, but its role has been reduced to something closer to symbolic presence than functional necessity. What makes this especially interesting is how invisible the process feels. There was no moment when people collectively decided the penny was too weak to matter. Instead, inflation simply shifted the ground underneath it until its original purpose no longer fit the economy it lived in. In the end, the penny's decline is not a story of disappearance. It's a story of gradual mismatch. A small coin remained unchanged in a world where the meaning of small itself kept evolving. The hidden cost of keeping it alive. At first glance, keeping the penny seems harmless. It's still legal tender, still familiar, still sitting quietly in jars, drawers, and cash registers across the country. But beneath that simplicity is a surprising economic question. What if maintaining the penny costs more than the penny is worth? This is where the debate around the United States 1-cent coin becomes unusual. Unlike most objects in circulation, the penny has a built-in contradiction. It represents 1 cent of value, yet it can cost more than 1 cent to produce and distribute. That mismatch is what has pushed economists and policymakers to repeatedly question whether it still makes sense to keep it in circulation. The cost doesn't come from a single source. It comes from the entire system behind the coin: raw materials, manufacturing, transportation, storage, and handling. Each step adds friction. Even something as small as minting billions of pennies every year becomes significant when scaled across an entire national economy. When the cost of producing a unit of currency exceeds its face value, the system starts to lose efficiency. But the real issue isn't just production, it's circulation. Every penny must be transported, counted, sorted, rolled, stored, and eventually recirculated or retired. Banks and retailers spend time and resources processing coins that individually carry almost no transactional weight. The more pennies exist in the system, the more logistical overhead they create. This is where the hidden cost becomes clearer. It's not just about metal and manufacturing, it's about attention, time, and infrastructure. Cashiers handle them, customers ignore them, businesses store them, banks process them, all for a unit of currency that often doesn't meaningfully change a transaction. In many cases, the penny's presence can even slow down commerce. Cash transactions require exact change or rounding strategies, adding small but repeated moments of friction. Individually, these delays seem trivial, but across millions of transactions, they accumulate into measurable inefficiency. There's also the question of opportunity cost. The resources used to produce and manage pennies could, in theory, be redirected toward more efficient parts of the monetary system. That doesn't mean the penny is dangerous or useless. It means it occupies space in a system where its utility has declined faster than its infrastructure has adjusted. Despite this, removing a coin from circulation is not a simple decision. Currency carries more than economic function. It carries familiarity, trust, and tradition. The penny has been part of daily life for generations. It appears in cultural expressions, childhood memories, and everyday routines. That emotional weight complicates purely financial reasoning. This tension is why the debate persists. On one side, there is the argument for efficiency. A system should not spend more maintaining a unit of currency than that unit contributes in value. On the other side, there is the argument for continuity. Even small symbols of money can hold disproportionate cultural significance. What makes the penny especially interesting is that both arguments are true at the same time. It is economically inefficient in many contexts, yet culturally persistent. It is practically diminished, yet symbolically familiar. That contradiction is what keeps it in circulation long after its usefulness has faded. So the hidden cost of the penny is just measured in cents. It's measured in friction, in maintenance, and in the effort required to keep a small piece of an older system alive inside a modern one. The psychology of dropping pennies. At some point, most people have seen a penny on the ground and made a split-second decision not to pick it up. That moment might seem trivial, but it reveals something deeper about how humans assign value not just in dollars and cents, but in time, effort, and attention. The interesting shift is not that pennies became less valuable in an official sense. It's that they became less valuable in perception. A coin that once represented meaningful purchasing power now often falls below the threshold of what people consider worth their effort to retrieve, and that threshold is not fixed. It changes based on context, habits, and economic conditions. This is where psychology begins to matter more than arithmetic. A penny is still 1 cent. That hasn't changed. But the human brain doesn't evaluate value in isolation. It compares value against cost, especially the cost of time and effort. Bending down, interrupting your movement, and storing a tiny coin all carry a mental price that competes with the coin's worth. When that effort feels greater than the benefit, the object becomes effectively invisible. This is why pennies on sidewalks are often ignored. It isn't carelessness, it's calculation, happening so quickly that it feels automatic. The brain is constantly filtering what deserves attention, and low-value items are quietly pushed out of awareness. This behavior reflects a broader principle. People don't just respond to monetary value, they respond to relative value. A penny in isolation is still currency, but compared to the speed and convenience of modern life, it can feel insignificant, especially in a world where most transactions are digital, and value is measured in larger, abstract units rather than physical coins. There's also a social layer to this behavior. If others are not picking up pennies, the behavior becomes normalized. What once might have been seen as frugality can begin to feel unnecessary or even strange. Social cues reinforce the idea that the effort is not worth it, even if the mathematical value remains unchanged. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. The less attention pennies receive, the less meaningful they feel. The less meaningful they feel, the less attention they receive. Eventually, they shift from being money on the ground to simply objects on the ground. The mind stops categorizing them as financial opportunities and starts categorizing them as irrelevant. This is one of the quiet ways economic systems evolve in everyday life, not through laws or announcements, but through repeated micro-decisions. Each moment of ignoring a penny is insignificant on its own, but collectively, these moments reflect a broader cultural reassessment of value. It also highlights something important about human decision-making. Value is never purely numerical. It is always filtered through convenience, context, and perception. A coin does not lose its official worth, but it can lose its felt worth. And that is the subtle story behind the psychology of dropping pennies. It isn't about rejecting money. It's about how the mind constantly negotiates between what something is worth on paper and what it is worth in the moment. What happens if the penny finally goes? The idea of the penny disappearing sounds dramatic, but in practice, its removal would likely feel surprisingly ordinary. There would be no sudden shock to daily life, no major disruption at checkout counters, and no change that most people could point to immediately. Instead, it would be a quiet adjustment to a system that has already been drifting in that direction for years. The most immediate change would happen in cash transactions. Prices would no longer be able to be settled exactly to the cent in physical currency. Instead, totals would likely be rounded to the nearest 5 cents. Some purchases would round slightly up, others slightly down, balancing out over time. For most people, the difference would be so small that it would barely register. On a day-to-day basis, digital payments would likely remain unaffected. Credit cards, debit cards, and mobile transactions already handle exact cent-level values without any need for physical coins. In fact, most modern purchases already occur without cash at all. This is one reason the penny's absence would feel less disruptive than its symbolism. Suggests the system has already moved beyond it in practice, where the change would be more noticeable in habits and routines. Cash registers would no longer need to store, sort, or dispense pennies. Retailers would no longer manage rolls of 1-cent coins. Bank systems would no longer circulate them in bulk. Over time, the physical presence of pennies in everyday life would slowly fade, replaced by rounding logic and digital precision. But the deeper impact is cultural rather than mechanical. The penny is one of the oldest continuous elements of U.S. currency, and its disappearance would mark the end of a long historical thread. That doesn't change how money works, but it does change how people relate to it. Coins often carry a sense of familiarity that extends beyond their monetary value. Language would also slowly drift. Sayings like "a penny for your thoughts" or "a penny saved is a penny earned" would remain, but they would feel even more detached from literal meaning. They would function purely as idioms, phrases preserved by tradition, rather than economic reality. In that sense, the penny would continue to exist in speech even after it stopped existing in wallets. There would also be a subtle psychological adjustment. People tend to anchor value to familiar units, even when those units are no longer practical. Removing the penny would require a shift in how small prices are perceived. But because inflation and cash rounding already blur cent-level precision, this adjustment would likely be gradual rather than abrupt. Economically, the system would become slightly more efficient. Transactions would move faster, handling costs would decrease, and one layer of complexity would be removed from physical currency. None of these changes would transform the economy, but they would streamline a process that has become increasingly outdated. What makes this scenario interesting is how uneventful it would feel compared to its historical significance. The penny has been part of everyday life for centuries, yet its removal would likely register less as a major event and more as a quiet update, like a background system being simplified. In the end, the disappearance of the penny wouldn't mark the loss of value. It would mark the completion of a long transition from a cash-heavy, fine-grained economy to one where small physical units are no longer necessary. The coin wouldn't vanish. Because it failed, it would fade. Because the system around it no longer needed it.